Record.
There you go.
Wonderful. All right, here we are. Um, okay, so kind of at a high level, this is Keenan's second week, I guess, here. And he'll be taking over all of the portfolio management stuff. I've kind of left that there, and I want to work together as a team to figure that out, and kind of discuss the best way to like split and where things are going to be split. Like technically, at this point in my mind, it's the portfolio management piece is epics and roadmaps, and that's the bulk of it right now, but it can probably evolve. I think the scope for everything else that was in team planning, now project management, is the same. So like there's no real changes other than changing the name and getting rid of a category. So now the category is more or less like the encompassing focus, and then there's going to be the group is there's going to be some categories that will fall out of that at some point in the future. But the biggest thing that I see us needing to do based on feedback from customers, and I think kind of going back in, sorry, I didn't have this pulled up before. I just thought that this would be helpful to go through so you guys are aware. Let's see here. Features is all right, so it's this one. This has a couple, I guess, customer stories in it, and it's worth like looking at. It's Epic 1715 and the GitLab org group. And I think this kind of like lays out a high level-ish vision of what we want to work towards solving over the next several months. And it kind of encapsulates a lot of good feedback on what we're missing. So there's a big thing right now where like our planning features and functionality doesn't support traditional agile methodologies very well, especially those that follow along the pattern of having a release and then within that having iterations or sprints. So there's a lot of issues around why our current like feature set makes that really difficult. And I think there's also some issues with how those things work, like the current milestones and the current Burndown charts, just because they're largely stateless and not event driven. So like if I were to have like a bunch of issues on a given release or a given milestone, and then we get to the end of the date of that milestone, and I move all those issues to another milestone, then it kind of erases the fact that I didn't complete all the stuff on the previous milestone that was there, which makes it pretty hard. So there's a bunch of issues around that I've kind of surfaced and kind of seen throughout my first few weeks working with this stuff. And does that make sense, or feedback or questions about that general idea?
No, sounds good.
Cool. Evics, I think that's the other thing. Let's see here. Reach out. We're addressing this largely with the Epic tree, which kind of is a little bit in limbo. I guess the path forward right now is to make it so that you can't move issues within from Epic to Epic, but that's like a temporary thing we'll need to work towards. But I think the relationship of the roadmap is like an important thing to take into account. The other one is like there's no visibility from a high level of organizational dates deliverables. Like there's a screenshot from Rally here if you want to look at it, but it's more or less having like a real roadmap view that has the relationships built in, as well as like completion criteria when things are done and how things are tracking and progressing, so that like you have your kind of two sets of user groups. You have your executives and director level that are going to want to use the roadmap view to get a sense of like, is an organization tracking along where we need to be? And then you have the teams like us who are like on the ground level being like, okay, let's plan these features and let's break everything out. But that also needs to be reflected back upstream, so there's a good cohesive end-to-end view. And I think this is like a little bit of feedback around there. I think this is also just like a terminology thing where a lot of agile methodologies don't use the concept of milestones or issues. They use stories and story points, not weights. So like I'm not as worried about this because we can solve for it later with other things. And I think this particular user was like, it's fine, like we can get used to it if that's what it's going to be, but it's just really weird. So that's a lower priority in my standpoint. And then kind of going through here, this talks about like an actual use case where there's like a large project. It requires collaboration between 4 different teams. let's say there's 10 features, 3 milestones. The overall product manager works with other stakeholders. Then there needs to be a way to lay out the high level view and plan, and then like indicate the parent-child relationship, which I think we're not that far off from that. Then the plan needs to be able to refine, ideally without screen switching, to add breakdowns into the leaf items. Are story small enough to be done in a sprint? So that's kind of one of the issues that we've been talking about, is like, if I want to work within the Epic view right now and I want to work on issues, I have to either go open a new tab or use like open and then go back, or just like do a lot of context switching that kind of breaks the flow of like, I want to work kind of fluidly to break these things down. And then the other one is in terms of like executing. Oh, this is another important one too, is the idea of user story size needs to be a first class concept. We have like a weight, but I think this particular use case was saying like, when we're looking at, let's say, an issue board, and we have a list that's our backlog, and we're together as a team in a room sitting, like we need a way to easily go through and have like kind of just like a quick way to do burndowns and to estimate those things and to talk about them. One of the products out there that I've used before, and I know exactly what he's talking about, was planning poker. And this one, yeah, it's a different screenshot. Interesting. Page. They must have changed their how it looks. But they have a whole product called Planning Poker. And I guess they changed it. But the whole gist is, this is it. I guess they moved to a different site. It's like it kind of turns it all into like a game where you can go through and you can easily, like as a team, pull in your list from your backlog, and you kind of like each score your things, and then it will pull together an aggregate score or a median score that then associates to that story, which syncs back to like the third party or external issue tracker that you're using. So this is kind of like the basic idea of like an easy way to collaborate as a team on breaking things down, estimating sizing as part of the release planning process. That's there. And this is more around like looking at your estimates versus actuals. And so the basic idea is like, if we have 100 points or 100 weight in the backlog, and we're doing X amount of weight per sprint or per iteration, then the amount of work that has been scoped that's ready for development is going to take about 4 weeks. And I think this kind of gets into some stuff that we've had internally where, Sean, you're like, I kind of just do it by my gut, but it's not always right. But I've been here long enough so I have a pretty good sense of it. And I think it's taking that kind of sense that you have of like what the team can relatively do and making it into more of a quantitative number that can be shared externally and relied upon. And then along with that, like having burn down charts that kind of track along those different things, looking at a velocity of a team over like a certain period of time. We've also surfaced this too, of like the engineering manager. I think I talked to one in Secure, and he maintains a separate issue board that has all of the engineers on it. And then that way he wants to have sub issues. So each engineer has a single issue that they're assigned to, with nobody else that has no other weights on it other than that engineer, so that he can do effective like capacity planning. And then there's a lot of other things just like around daily stand-ups and wishing that was integrated in. I think that's going to be something that happens later, but all of that kind of feedback, and you can read this more, kind of comes into wanting to put together a plan of like, how do we get from where we are today, something that better addresses what is a traditional agile project management methodology that a lot of these companies use. Does that make sense? Feedback, questions, pushback?
Yeah, basically like you said, like Sean has this, like has an intuition for this, but I don't. So one of the things I've been doing is tracking the last few releases, the velocity in just a spreadsheet, so that I can get an idea when we go to plan, say the next, say 12.4, then I know like roughly the number of points that the team can deliver. And I know that like the current release, I can see it. There's 200 points of weight assigned to issues that are open or in this milestone, basically, whether they're open or not. And that's roughly like double what we have accomplished the last two releases. So I know there's some kind of thing there where we like double the number of points we do, and we take stuff out through the or descope stuff throughout the milestone. But like In the past, I've actually used those exact was it mountain goats or whatever plan and poker cards.
Yeah.
And I think like these kind of you could shoehorn like an agile thing into what we have at the minute, but like it would be that like you don't have great visibility over velocity. I don't think, which makes it difficult to plan.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, but didn't the kind of general guidelines change from instead of doing like saying planning more than you think you're going to get done, like to try to plan it right at 100% capacity? So to have a fairly accurate or
Yeah, for a while we tried a thing where we said that we were aiming to ship roughly 70% of what we put in a milestone. And I think there you had a problem. It can also apply to the OKRs, but I think its word is slightly different there, which is just that it encourages you to pad it by like 50%, rather than actually like change how you plan things, right? So like I think it's much more intuitive for people to plan to target, and then if you're beating that target you can be more ambitious, and if you're not meeting that target you need to look and see whether you're being too ambitious or whether you're underestimating or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's well and good. It's confusing for me too, just because I don't look at the Burndown as like a reflection of the team's capabilities. I look at it as a reflection of a bigger system, where like there's any given different variable that's influencing whether something gets done or not, right? And I know there are the tendencies for some organizations to hyper focus on like a velocity number and like judge a team's performance based on that velocity without taking into account like, are they blocked by things? Is there a lot of technical debt? Like, what's the underlying root cause of why things are going slow? Like, is there a product manager who's not reviewing things? But all that to say is like, I would like us to see getting to the point where when we put something in a release, where we have a high confidence level that it can be done. And that's where it's not just velocity, but it's also looking at your volatility from release over release. And those are the two like metrics that I'm used to tracking, is that in this kind of Scrum based model that we're doing, and the more like Kanban based model, I look at a lot of other things like throughput and lead time and stuff. And I think that's where there's enough of a deviation in the customer base that want both. But I will say, like, overall in the broader market, there's a higher percentage of companies that are practicing Scrum, and a but much smaller percentage of companies that are practicing Kanban. I think it's something like 54% to 8%. But I think we kind of need to work towards supporting both. So that was kind of gist of this. And instead of like hyper focusing on a given methodology, I think about it as two forms of planning. One is continuous and one is time boxed, right? So continuous, you don't have traditional releases. You work in a continuous manner and you work to improve throughput. And the time box, you plan ahead and try to make sure that you fit just the right amount of stuff in that plan to get done at the end of the time box. And so then you can either adjust scope or you can adjust time, but you can't like do both. So there's like kind of different nuances to each, but I think with our kind of core construct of the issue boards right now, we can get to supporting both fairly straightforward way. Underpinning all that is like the desire to want to build a more modern and collaborative experience for teams to work on. I think the whole point of GitLab is to make it easy for teams to collaborate. And right now, because things aren't that real time in many respects, like if I update something on a given board, like we can't even do anything like planning poker unless we implement like serious long pulling all over the place, or unless we get to doing something with like WebSockets. Just because if we want things to be updating in real time as we do release planning or iteration planning or whatever, like that's kind of a no-brainer. So that kind of brings me to the first topic of real-time boards. And I just want to talk through with each of these like relative complexity so that I understand them. And then I'll go back. That's not the real-time one. Whoops. I'll have to go find that very quick, unless anybody has that handy.
That was my number one question on my list.
I just fixed the issue link in the issue, so the issue description does update. So
cool. So we can look at this one. And is that because that's just for my own learning? Is that set up to do long polling?
It's not long polling. It's just polling with efficient caching.
Okay. Okay.
Because the description doesn't change much, and it's easy to know when it changed. So, yeah.
Cool. So real-time board lists backend. I think like this kind of brings us to like a strategy of this is like an end goal, but there are probably like little things that we can do to get there along the way to test things like in a to build more minimum like kind of viable changes, if that makes sense. And I haven't updated this card yet, but I wanted to talk through some of these things, like the basic idea, board config changes. This is not in scope. That's fine for an MVC. I think it should be eventually. List changes, if somebody adds, removes, or reorders a list on the board, this is not in scope. Again, I would say that it should be, but it's fine for the MVC. And then when certain attributes data changes in a title, this is not in scope.
Actually, because that's already like pollable, that's actually not too hard to do necessarily. Just with the caching we have, but it wouldn't be very useful to just update the titles and descriptions. Well, you can't see a description on a board anyway at the moment, but it wouldn't be too useful to just update the titles in real time on the board. I don't think that's what anybody sees as a viable MVC for that. So yeah, I think the last two.
Okay, and so this is more or less changes labels, assignees, milestones that may appear on different lists on the board, or if somebody just like, I guess this is not here. Oh, I guess changing labels, but in the specific use case of like, I drag an issue from one lane to another, depending on like, sometimes that's not, if it's not a scope label, it's not going to update the labels, and it might not update the milestones. But like that's the basic gist of like, if a label moves or an issue moves from one list to another list, then it gets updated in real time.
Yeah, so I think the reason it's phrased this way is because if you drag, so it's not about scope labels. It's about if you drag an issue from one list to another, it will update the labels, assignees or milestones, depending on what the lists are. But you can also move an issue between lists by just updating the labels on the issue, or by updating the assignees on the issue, or by updating the milestones on the issue. So I think the way it's written that way to say that it doesn't matter where the change comes from, the board should reflect that. Yeah, actually, it would be a lot easier to do it if the change could only come from the same board, but I don't think that would be very intuitive. And the other problem is like, if you look at like how many boards we have in the GitLab org group, it's a lot. So yeah.
Cool. I'm going to come back and I will work on updating this a little bit more to make that clear, but I agree. I think that's the same. If I remember correctly, one of the main dependencies on this was let's see, well, we don't have WebSocket support right now in the product at all, period.
Yeah, so if we want to use WebSockets, that other issue needs to be done first. And there are some open questions about that, but I think the memory team have it in 12.4. Memory group, sorry. Well, I guess it's mostly a backend team, but yeah, the memory group have it in 12.4 right now. So I don't know who the PM for memory is, but maybe it's kind of a chicken and egg one, that as well, because I don't know if they're able to implement WebSocket support without a feature that uses WebSockets, and maybe they need another group to help on the actual like feature side of that. I don't know.
Would it be like do you think that we ought to, sorry, I'm going to make sure, collaborate with them, or what's the best way to like plan this out? Like, because I know there are lots of other things that, if I recall correctly, need to be cleaned up on the issue boards, from like a refactoring, making it modern. I know it doesn't use code splitting yet for some of the different packages or components. There's a lot of other things that I think, it was like, you told me it was one of the first Vue apps that was ever written in GitLab, so it's a little bit more antiquated.
Yeah, there's an issue to port it over to Vuex as part of, or refactor the store over to Vuex. I think it does use Vuex, but it was one of the earlier ones that did. So Winnie did a great job of splitting that epic into smaller issues. We just haven't actually prioritized that. So it's been, I think it originally was in 12.1, and then it moved to 12.2, and now it's in 12.3, and I still don't think it's going to get done in 12.3. So I think that's the first thing we kind of, at least on the front end, that we need to prioritize.
One question right quick, just to make sure we're like going down the best path, and I totally defer to you guys for the technical decisions, but I do have a decent amount of experience with GraphQL and just like with Apollo, and I think we're using Apollo on the front end, right? And if we are, then Apollo uses some, I'm not sure what the Vue Apollo integration looks like, but it's probably using Vuex under the hood already. So when I was using like GraphQL Apollo with React and Redux, it got to the point where Redux was kind of like a little bit like unnecessary, especially after Apollo added the support for local storage or local state. So that way, like you could define things that were local outside of your queries and mutations, and store that in the same store. And so like it's almost like there's a duplicated like effort. And I guess that's just where, from like a technical standpoint, if the goal is to get to using GraphQL and Apollo for these sorts of things, does it make sense to also duplicate everything into Vuex and then like make it obsolete like just a little bit down the road?
Yeah, I'll share the main kind of architecture issue around eventually getting everything over to Apollo. But I do think that is the ideal end result, is to not use Vuex and to move everything over to Apollo GraphQL. As far as this one, so where we're using GraphQL has primarily, at least on our team on the front end, has been around epics and the epic tree. We haven't done much as far as the APIs that the board uses to get that into GraphQL yet. So if we want to go that route, which I think eventually we will, it's still going to require a decent amount of work getting all that over to GraphQL.
Yeah, I think from the backend perspective, like the current code is not really a concern, but it we don't provide this information through GraphQL. So then the question is like, do we want to add to the scope of the refactor by getting to the desired end state sooner, by sort of rewriting the store and also using GraphQL, or do we want to split them up and take more time overall? I don't know the answer to that. Like, but that's the trade-off as I see it.
Well, I guess the general like rule I have is like, when faced with two potential options, which one is going to allow us to make future change easier? So in this case, like we know we want to get to this point down here, we can take an incremental step here, but then like what is going to be the onus to have us implement that future state? And like if we're already done with this state, it's almost like coming in behind the scenes, and how much work do you think would be duplicated in that process versus just doing it correctly or doing it to the ideal state?
So to be clear, there are two future states here that we're talking about, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So like one future state is from like a technical perspective, we want to use GraphQL, but for users, that's not super interesting. It is useful to people who are using the GraphQL API themselves, but for most people, it's not that interesting. The end state that's most user impactful is this one, the real-time ports, right? That's the goal.
Yes, that is, but we also like have it on our roadmap to do all that other stuff. So I guess I'm just saying, like, which one is going to make the most logical sense and prevent or produce the least amount of duplicated effort in the long run? Like, let's say we have everything working. That's where it's like,
yeah, we'd need to think about it. Yeah. I think that's more on Donald's team than mine, but we definitely need to think about like what the two options entail.
Okay. I'm open to either. Like, I think, I want to get value to the customers as quickly as possible, but I also want to build things in a way that enables us to move faster down the road. And like, I know how, for me personally, as a front-end engineer, I prefer working with GraphQL much over REST APIs and how much faster and easier it is. But that's just my experience, but I'll leave it up to you guys. Okay, the next one was kind of burn down charts on boards, and there's a bunch of issues about this. And let's see here. The basic idea is like, if we have an issue on a board, should it get scoped to that board? And I think this is like the biggest thing that I would like to see, because like right now, looking at the burn down for a given milestone, it's hard to see like what is the DevOps plan role in this and where are we at. So I think there's like a lot of proposals here. One for is making this like I guess having where is it on this view? Oh, the burn down right here, which would toggle that on. And then I would think, I haven't read through all of the comments on this yet, but I would think that it would also, like, the issues would be scoped to whatever the board is scoped to. What do you guys think about this, or have any input?
So I did have one question, which was sort of a general question, just because don't know why it didn't occur to me before, but like there's an analytics group, but burn down charts don't belong in the analytics group. They belong in the plan stage. But I'm not sure that, I mean, you could make a case for it. I'm just not sure which way we want to end up. Second thing is just to check that we want the burn down chart to work with the current state of things. So we don't want to say there were 20 issues in DevOps plan yesterday, but then we relabeled 10 of them to like not be DevOps plan. So today there are 10, but we didn't close any either. There are just 10. Like, do we want to track that, or do we just want to say the issues that are in DevOps plan now have followed this course throughout the month?
I think it followed this course throughout the month. If the issues get moved elsewhere, then that's the same thing as adding or reducing scope to any given like thing, right? So like, I don't see that as an issue. The thing that is weird to me in this case, like for our use case, we use a board, but it's not scoped to a specific milestone. It's scoped to like a label, and then we have sub scopes for groups. And I think this kind of gets into the mechanism of like, one of the other issues we'll talk about is multiple milestones per issue. And how do we want to reconcile, like, we're working on a current release, but our board isn't scoped to that specific release? A, should it be? Or B, like, do you allow people to select different milestones in this view to like view them? You know, I guess that's the thing.
Yeah, at the moment, the concept of a burn down chart that we have is tightly coupled to a milestone. So you're right, I don't have an answer to that, but like, it's a burn down chart for a milestone, which is easy to scope down from there. I think we could scope it out, but it's sort of more of a product and UX question when we scope it out from that. So yeah, don't have an answer.
Do we want to try to get the analytics group to take over ownership of this? I do know some of the stuff that they're working on right now is the concept of custom, what's the cycle analytics report, where the different stages can be configured. So you can say, you know, like the backlog stage, the planning stage, the in development stage, and they're mapping that to the actual events, if they think from the events API. And then based on that, they're going to run analytics against merge requests, but they haven't quite figured out how to incorporate issues into that. And so I'm trying to partner with them, but the way that I kind of like see this in a perfect world is like, ideally we give teams like the option, or like on a board, the option to set like some sort of recurring, you know, release schedule or sprint schedule, and then we auto generate milestones for them and let those milestones get associated to an issue. And then like, that's comes after you can have 2 milestones per issue. So do we want to like table this and focus on the other things that would make this more meaningful for a report? Or like, what's, I guess that's where it's hard to understand what the relative complexity is of just like, can we just put this on an issue board and then like use the scope that's there and then allow people to select a milestone? Or I guess there's like a lot of nuances we need to think through. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, table means exactly the opposite in British English to US English. So in British English, it means to put something forward for discussion. I don't know what it is in Ireland, John, but Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
That's a good thing. It means to put it on the back burner to like set it aside. But
yeah, it's a classic trap.
Fascinating.
We say
I'm gonna call that out as I learned something really important today.
Yeah, just don't use that word, because people will have to know like which context you're using it in. They're opposites.
You could say punt it too, but I think that's
Yeah, I mean, I suppose anybody who follows sports would have a reasonable idea of what that meant, but it's not super obvious.
We should put this on the onboarding.
We should.
So sorry, yeah, back to the main point. So there are a couple of things here. Like, I don't think scoping the data for a Burndown chart to match a board scope, assuming that also includes a milestone somehow, is particularly hard from the back end perspective. But we were just talking about, like, if we're putting it on a board itself, we were just talking about sort of technical debt in boards. So I don't know, Donald, how much impact that would have there.
Yeah. We'd probably still want to do the refactor of the boards first, but I think even I was just looking through kind of the mocks that we have for this, and we might be able to treat it somewhat separately from the actual kind of like its own page. So it might not be. We might be able to work on this in parallel to the refactor of boards on the front end.
Well, I think that's the thing. Just like issue boards are gonna become an increasingly focal part of like the project management group and facilitating workflows, and I want them to be, and they should be. So things like, I would say from every release, we're going to be doing stuff that's either adding functionality or refactoring or improving it or making things do differently, from like what the card faces look like on the issue boards to like what stuff is real time to what other things we add, like, and how we can scope it. And like it's gonna, even getting to the point where we have swim lanes, like horizontal or vertical swim lanes, within each list, you can break a list into different swim lanes. There's a lot of things that I think we're going to want to do in the next year. And so if we need to just like slow down and refactor the boards to get them correct, and maybe use something like the real time piece to make that like to support the memory group as they do that as an actual feature in use case, that makes the most sense to me, instead of stuffing these things in. And then that would give us a little bit more time to like do some customer discovery and validation to say like exactly how should this work and how should the scopes work, and should we add the idea of sprints and iterations of some form, or auto-generating milestones. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there is always that trade-off of delivering something quickly, but the idea that we can lay stronger or better foundation so we can iterate quicker in the future, like, I don't know. It's, for me, that's often an easy trade-off. But I think we want to also get to the point where we can make faster changes as we discover more stuff.
Okay, let's go back right quick. I'm going to skip over the cumulative flow stuff because I think that should live in analytics, but the basic idea is it's sort of close to the cycle analytics. It's just a different presentation of the data. And like, I think it's an important thing that we need to add very quickly, but it makes sense to me to figure out how to bring in the idea of like a workflow first. You can have it based on labels, but what happens if the label changes? And there's like a lot of dependencies. As I was sorting over this over the weekend and last week, I think it's something we need to do very soon, and maybe in 12.5 or 12.6. I'm going to talk to Virginia in the analytics group to see how we can make it happen. Let's see here. This is also along a similar type line of a small thing we maybe could work towards doing. But like right now, I think the Burndown charts, they're stateless. I guess the question number one is, do we want to formally ask this move into the analytics group? We maybe still will contribute to it if we don't get support to move it along in time, but as a baseline thing, should Burndowns live in analytics?
I mean, we've got to kind of look at it two ways. One, whose kind of charter or goal, which stages goal does it make more sense in, and which team has the actual capacity to take on, to prioritize this. From that standpoint, I think we should move it over, because I feel like we've got plenty of other stuff that we want to prioritize over any types of burn down charts or any types of analytics. As far as which team it belongs in, which goal it fits better, that I don't know.
Should it be, so I'm not 100% on how these work, but should it be a category? Because it's not right now. And like, if we're talking a lot about burn down charts, maybe it should be, because like, you know, when we did the headcount planning for FY20, so FY20 starts in February 2019 and ends in the end of January 2020, I think. We used the categories that were on the page you're on at the time, and those have changed slightly since. But there wasn't a burn down category then, and there isn't a burn down category now. I'm guessing it fit into project management before, but we didn't have an explicit, like, this is how much capacity we expect to be spending on burn down charts specifically then, and I don't think we do now. So it makes it, I mean, that's obviously not your fault, Gabe. You weren't here at the time. Like, I think I'm the only person who was here at the time we did that exercise. I was on parental leave. But my point is, it makes it very hard to answer that question if we don't have a category and we haven't thought before about like how much time we're specifically spending in burn down charts. I think both sound reasonable to me. Like, I don't think either is a terrible decision. So yeah, maybe making a category would be the first step, and just sort of trying to track how much effort we do put into it now and how much effort we want to put into it would be a good start.
Okay. Yeah,
So,
I'll take that action item. But what were you gonna say, Donald?
I was just going to ask Sean. VSM was a category before, like when we did the planning for this financial year. VSM was a category, right? Because that was an example of it was an example of one where we had originally, and then there was a proposal from which manage, I believe.
Yeah, it moved into the analytics group inside the managed stage. So the analytics group currently is responsible for DevOps score, code analytics, and value stream management. And then burn down is slightly different because of those analytics items, it's the only one that only applies to issue tracking, which is, I guess, where you could say that it belongs in the project management side. But we haven't explicitly called that out at any point, so I think it might be useful. Maybe I don't know if it like qualifies as a product category is my only question, but I think like it would be useful to sort of be explicit about where it lives.
Yeah, I don't think I wouldn't put burnout in its own category, but what it does belong in is a category around, like, I don't know what the name is, but cumulative flow, like your burn down, all that stuff is really just giving you insight as whether you have the right capacity and resources allocated to complete a given scope. So like in your triangle, you have scope, time, resources, or costs. Anyway, and like it's making decisions around trade-offs for those things. And so I think there is a lot of good. There's some overlap with value stream management, but not really, because it's not. Value stream management is like a higher level look at like lots of things, and this is applicable to like a team. So I will work to bring some more clarity around that. And I also think we should connect with Virginia and talk about how we want to overlap. And now that we have like a set of things that we need to do, because this is what customers want. This is not like, this has to happen for them, and for them to use the project management tools effectively, how to like a tangible roadmap, I guess, to work together with them or to take this stuff on. So we can set that aside. Is that a better word instead of table? Set that aside for just the time being.
Sure. Yeah.
This is like another little type 1, but issue board with multiple groups and or project scope. So right now you can only scope on milestone, assignee, and label. This brings on the idea that you can assign or scope a board to given set of projects or groups. Thoughts about this?
Yeah, a bunch. There's a related issue that I added there. I also added it in the description. It's called instance level epics. So the concern with having, so at the moment, boards can only sort of flow downwards, if that makes sense. So you can have a board on a parent group and it can see everything in its children groups. You can have a board on one of those child groups and it can see everything below it, but it can't see anything adjacent to it, any siblings, and it can't see anything above it. And what that means is for assignees, this doesn't really matter too much. But in terms of like permissions for viewing the board, it can be very straightforward. Permissions for can you move a thing can be very straightforward. And also what object you use. So for instance, you have a label list on a board. If you have, I don't know, the DevOps : plan label on a board, and you have two different groups that both have the DevOps : plan label, do you need to add two lists? Do you need to add one list? Like when I say they have a label, I mean they have a label with that name. That's the tricky part there. I did suggest in the instance level epics thing, because epics behave in the same way, right? Like you can only add a thing to an epic if it's below in the hierarchy. And we have this problem where we have at least two top level groups. We actually have a few more, but like you can think about GitLab org where our code is and GitLab com where our organizational stuff is. So one thing I suggested was that you would be able to create a portfolio, as in portfolio management, which is like a group, but it doesn't change membership and it doesn't change the URL structure or anything like that. So it works for like labels, milestones, boards, epics, stuff like that, but it doesn't work for membership. And that might be related to teams too, because at the moment you have to use groups for everything related to organizing things. So a portfolio might be a way of organizing like your project management stuff and across multiple projects, so a portfolio, I guess. And then a team might be a way of organizing people that isn't a group necessarily. And those two things seem kind of related to me, but yeah, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
No, I've been struggling with the same thing. I actually have like slight tangent. I've been working on kind of a diagrammy of things, which I'll share after I'll get you guys a link. But the basic idea is like you have, the idea of teams and how teams and that structure relate to like how they organize around what the value of the company is delivering and projects and that sort of thing. And then how does that break down to like ownership of issues? And there's kind of like another related thing over here where, and I guess this is a good use case to talk about. There's this proposal made to add the ability for issues to be assigned to groups. And it seems like this also makes sense because if you look at how we're using labels, it's more or less assigning it to a group. And if people are organizing into groups and then you add the portfolio level kind of like construct, then you can use groups more for organization of people and access to like, code. And then you could use the other construct for the more playing type things. But I don't know if they like all correspond together or not.
Yeah, so yeah, for the specific issue about instance level epics, I think anything instance level obviously is a challenging idea on a multi-tenant instance like GitLab.com, because if you can only manage that if you're an administrator, it works for us, but it doesn't work for everybody else using GitLab.com. But having an arbitrary collection of groups in particular, I think, is valuable. I'm less convinced about the value of an arbitrary collection of projects for stuff like this. Is how I would look at it. So yeah.
Okay, I will spend some time in digesting all this. I don't want to take time to do it here, but this also kind of relates to another. I don't have the issue in front of me, but more or less, people, internal customers have expressed the most pain point that I've seen. But being able to work across these two groups, which they can't do right now in any sort of way. So this is kind of the same gist of like, how do we solve for that? But also I would say like, I think we need to figure out how to solve for a way that it's not like it works for all groups in GitLab, not like just the admins. And I don't know what the best way to solve for that. So
yeah, I think
I'll read all this.
Yeah, just to be clear there as well, like I don't think my proposal is the only way to do it. I think this also relates to, I think there's an issue somewhere, maybe you already put it in the thingy, about being able to promote a group label up a level. And if you could promote these group labels, so like you add a couple of groups to a portfolio, promote their groups and milestones up to the portfolio level, then I think that already helps a lot. You don't have to keep labels in sync between two different groups or multiple groups. You don't have to keep milestones in sync. You can use them across those, like even without anything else. I think that's got a reasonable amount of value on its own. Yeah,
okay.
That wasn't.
I'll read through all that and we'll see where it fits in. But I agree that I think there's something that we need to address there. This next one's really small, but it's been requested and it makes sense. It's more or less just to be able to get time out. And I think this impacts specifically our professional services group, but also anybody who's using the time tracking feature to be able to get like reporting down on an individual level, if that makes sense. So this is something that we need to do, and like it should go in, but the basic output is being able to spit out a CSV that has the information on it. And I think that's where I spoke briefly with David. He said that would be great.
Yeah, he messaged me on Slack as well. I think I think we are like, this is literally like this hopefully, I hope I don't regret saying this, but this seems like a quick win, because like we already stored this data. Like it's not like we need to go back and like start like doing something different. We already store this. We just need to, and I use just advisedly, we just need to present it to the user in some way, which starts off as a CSV, which is a fairly sort of universal format. So yeah, 100% in favor of doing this and getting it moving.
Okay, cool. That works. This other one is kind of big. I don't know if it's big or not, but is there any reason why we couldn't work towards having the idea of multiple milestones per issue? And I know you mentioned if we want, I think was that you, if we want to do this, we need to, before we do that, do,
we don't need to do another thing. It was just because I was talking to Andreas, who's the database maintainer, about how we filter labels right now. Because we match by title, but we add a label by ID, and because you can match multiple labels and because it's quite denormalized, it makes the resulting SQL query quite complicated. And Andreas had a suggestion for some denormalization that would really help, especially as we now don't have to support MySQL, we can just support Postgres. Yes, so that's a thing that we could get started on. Like, so that would already be a win for looking up labels. It would make it faster, but it would also make it much more composable on the code side. And then we would also need something like this eventually for milestones. I don't think it's a blocker. It's just these are related. We might want to do. We might want to get started on that other one.
So do you think should we prioritize this for 12.4 and do it in conjunction with the milestone thing? Or, I mean, I guess that's where like, I don't know how much stuff is going to fit, you know?
Yeah. So my concern with doing this in 12.4 is that we already have the other request, which is like further down the bottom, which is a higher priority about the making the participants more efficient. So like the mentioned users, so going from implicit subscriptions. So you've got those in the issue description in the right order, in the 12.4 issue description in the right order, I would say. And this isn't a blocker to doing multiple milestones per issue. So if you want to prioritize multiple milestones per issue ahead of this, I've got no problem with it. I just want to keep that other one on the radar, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. So we talked about briefly this, just bigger picture, longer term. I think we need to work towards having the concept of teams be like a first class thing, whether we extend groups or make groups more team friendly. Long term, we won't be able to do very effective capacity planning if and resource allocation like in the product itself, unless there's a clear distinction of who's on what team and what time, how much time do they have, and where are they allocating their time across projects or groups or like whatever, and then tracking against that, and so this is the first proposal. It was, I think Kenny proposed it, and it was to add a field team that can be assigned only to a pre-created group, and GitLab future iterations could do interesting things like auto-assign teams based on certain parameters. So it would basically be adding, there's this reference here, some sort of like team drop down to assign it to a group. And then I guess, what are the considerations if we were to do this from a technical standpoint?
I think there are a couple of questions, just sort of general ones. So everything in an issue, pretty much everything in an issue right now is visible if you can see the issue. So some related issues might not be visible, but like things like, the assignee, all users are always visible to everybody. Epics, if you can see an issue, I believe you can see an epic. If you can see an issue, you can certainly see its milestone. If you can see an issue, you can see its labels, etc. But groups don't work that way. So, that's because they also work for the other cases that you mentioned in your comment further down, right? Like you all can also organize projects in a group. So that's why you might want a group not to be visible. But a team, if a team was not possible to be hidden, that would make it a lot easier, I think. And it would make it more conceptually aligned with a user, which again, all users are always visible to all other users. So
groups are not visible. Like if I'm in group A, subgroup B, and then there's a group C with a subgroup D, the subgroups couldn't see each other. Is that accurate?
So what I mean is groups can have visibility. So like a project, they can be private, internal, or public. And if they're private, then only members of the group can see the group.
Okay.
So yeah. So that's the wrinkle there. I guess we could just say you can only use a public group as a team though. And like if you make a group private and it's assigned to any issues as a team, we unassign them or something like that. But yeah, I think from a product perspective as well, I don't think that sort of complexity that we have around groups really makes sense for what we want to do with teams, like where you can be visible or not visible depending on the user.
Yeah. Okay, I'll circle back, but do you think this is a good idea from like a value standpoint? I mean, I know you don't care.
It's not clear to me like what. So it says this might also make future searching boards and analytics at a team level easier to set up defaults for. But are we saying that you can filter by team initially or not? Because I don't totally get why we'd add a field that you can't do anything with except just see on the sidebar. But maybe that is the MVC. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be like longer term. I don't know in terms of the MVC, but thinking about it in our use case, like let's say we have our team and we're a group, and then we want to say, let's say for our group, we want to have 2-week-long iterations, and so I maybe could configure some stuff in our team that like this is our default settings. So when we go to create an issue board, then it breaks those things in. Because it's part like and the team is assigned the issue board, then it brings in some of those configuration settings automatically, and we'll create like those kind of constructs, the 2-week iteration constructs as we go, and it's tied back to the team, not to like an arbitrary issue board that anybody can see. That's not. It's kind of just trying to open the door for having more tightly coupled things, and so immediately there's not a ton of added value for this. But what would be one additional thing to add on top of this is an MVC to add more tangible value of like why you would want to add a team to an issue. Can you think of anything off the top of your head? If not, I'm going to keep this in the validation backlog and go through those cycles with UX and some customer discovery. But
the one case I can think, well, no, the only thing I was thinking there was like, when you get auto assigned by the security bot to an issue because it's not been like assigned to somebody already, like a day after we started the milestone, maybe putting it on a team would make more sense, but maybe the point of the security bot is to have a DRI. So maybe that wouldn't help for that. So I can't think of any use cases we have for that.
Yeah, the only
Right
use
now
case.
it's hurting us. Sorry.
No, you're good. The only use case I can think off the top of my head is somebody creates an issue and assigns it to a team so that they can triage it, research it, look into it. But I think that gets solved through other ways currently. So.
Okay, cool. I'll do some validation on that stuff. The other things, I think we're out of time, so we can go ahead and like be respectful of time and this. But these technical things, just real quick, create tables for mentioned users in Markdown. This stuff is all fine if we need to do it. It's not huge, is it? Like none of it seemed like it was huge.
So this is 100% backend work. It is already broken down into probably it was a while since I created them, but probably what are the smallest possible issues. But yeah, it's a reasonable amount of work, but it's not like, I think the priority from the infrastructure team for this is more like, as long as we're working on it, that's fine. Like if it takes a while, it takes a while, and that's fine for them. So I don't think we need to, I don't know how I'm trying to express that. Does that make sense? Like,
as long as we're making progress on it, they're happy.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah.
Cool. We didn't talk about labels, but I think, I don't know if we're going to be able to fit those things in. Maybe can save that for another day. And then this other idea of like, what do we need to do to make it so that you can work with an issue anywhere? Like from a issue board or from an Epic view. Is there any like technical, as I go through and think about playing for this and validating it, are there any technical considerations to take into account of why we couldn't have an issue in all of its glory, slide open and a overlay or something?
It's one for Donald.
Yeah, I think that's primarily UX question. I don't see. I mean, we use the APIs in other places. So.
Okay. What about the one use case I could think of is like if I go and edit this issue and I change some of the labels and I update the title and then I save it and then I go back, is in this, let's say this issue was on an issue board or was on a Epic view, would those details be updated or would I have to refresh the page?
Yeah, that's a good use case that we need to solve for. I mean, we can do what we do in other places where we trigger a refresh.
But will we have to, because we already have that, we should theoretically already have that data.
Yeah.
Of what, like, what's it called? And Apollo speak. I don't know if everything's using GraphQL, but it's whatever loading. It's like optimized loading or basically because the client already has the data that will be repopulated. It updates the UI and then it will like do a new fetch to backfill the state, if that makes sense, or the cache or something like that. Optimistic loading is what it's called.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. I'll take a look at that.
All right, cool. Anything else that we need to talk about for this specifically right now? Like, I think the things that have changed is that we now have until I think the 18th is when the kickoff call is. So we'll need to decide all this stuff. We have a little bit more time to plan now. And I would like to spend the next little bit of time getting all of these things like in order in terms of like a more tangible roadmap of how they fit together and how they would flow. Is there any other considerations that I should take into account when thinking through those things?
Well, if you want it to be more continuous anyway, right? So like, I think
Yes.
as soon as something's ready, it can go on a 12.4 milestone and we can put it in the ready for development states, I guess, like even before then. Are we actually changing? So I know we changed the date of the kickoff. Did we actually change anything else like around, like, because at the moment we changed milestones on the 8th. We didn't change that yet, right? We just changed the date of the kickoff.
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, it's just we do a security release on like the 20-something, each month. So if we change the start date of a milestone to the 18th, we don't have enough time to fix any security issues that need to be fixed by the 20-something. So we need to bring those forward. But
okay, I'll double check, but I believe the only thing that's changing is the date for the kickoff call.
Cool. Yeah, so let's, I guess you, me, and Donald, Gabe, for the ones for project management, like talk about specifically the ones that we think are close to getting ready for development and that you think are high impact, and make sure we get those in first, and then sort of follow up on the other ones once we've done those. I think that's probably the best way, right?
Yep, I'll reach out to Virginia today or tomorrow to try to get a meeting scheduled with her to like how we want to break down some of the work and overlap stuff, and then think about I'll follow up on the stuff for the burndowns or project related charts and seeing if that belongs in its own category or if it's within issue tracking, and kind of go from there. And then I think that should be good. And I know, Keenan, there's some stuff in portfolio management, like if you start looking through and thinking about what you can and can't do with the epics. I mean, we can go through that stuff, but there's a lot of things that are still like in progress that I feel like have stalled over a couple releases that maybe like now that we did the split, there's going to be dedicated resources. We'll be able to catch up and get some of those things done. But let's work together over the next few days too to like flesh out those things and get that on this list as well.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.